Hi, I'm Rubina Gaspar.
And I'm Austin Gaspar.
And we're here with Dr. William Gaspar and Eva Gaspar to talk about their new book, God's Generator. The book talks about 3 black holes and their relation to creation mythology. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gaspar to give us a little synopsis about the book.
Okay, so basically what we are talking about is the 3 black holes that commonly appear in creation mythology. Now, they are not presented as black holes necessarily, but we see in the star constellations, for example, Orion is probably the best example. That is always present in most of the mythology, almost all continents. I mean, you start with Native Americans, you find it. You can even go to the Bible, the Torah. You see it in a classical Greek mythology where Orion, love story with Pleiades, so that Orion is truly present in most of the stories of the ancients. And just about 6-7 years ago, scientists told us that there is a black hole in the Orion Nebula.
Wow, interesting. So, can you tell us a little more about what they discovered in that black hole?
So, Cornell University put out a report from Dr. Schuber and international team of astrophysicists in 2012, and they reported that they found a runaway black hole, is how they call it, in the Orion Nebula, which is the middle star of the Sword of Orion.
The constellation of Orion's belt or the sword?
The sword.
Okay.
The middle star in a sword. And when you start looking at that Orion Nebula, the interesting thing is that we tie it to other cultures. We see it not just in, let's say, the Egyptian or the Native American stories, but we start finding it in one of the interesting places, in the Vatican.
Really? Yeah, I believe your book mentions something about the painting in the Vatican, the creation of Adam, and somehow that correlates. Could you explain a little more about that to us?
The painting of creation of Adam was done by Michelangelo. It was commissioned by Pope Julius II, and basically that was about the Orion Nebula. And something was totally amazing when we discovered that there was no telescopes at that time. So when they show this Orion Nebula and then have God painted into the background of the Orion Nebula, as we later figured out, where the black hole is where God's heart would show up on that painting.
Interesting, because I believe you're referring to, if you overlaid the picture of the Orion Nebula, it almost fits perfectly on top of that picture, right? You can virtually fade them in and out, and they're very distinct points that show the correlation of that specific nebula and parts of that painting that fit like a glove.
Correct. It's amazing. There's an esoteric author who wrote an ebook called Orion in the Vatican. And in that, he has pictures showing this concept that you're talking and mentioning. But also there are YouTube videos that are very detailed, and there's no question that the Orion Nebula is the one that's presented as the background for God in the paintings of creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel.
Wow.
Of all places.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I believe that in your book you also mentioned that it somehow relates to the human brain, that picture in the Vatican, the creation of Adam.
A very interesting thing happened. Around 1990s, there was a OBGYN doctor. His name is Lynn Franklin Mashberger, MD. He went to the Vatican and he looked at the painting, and all of a sudden the thought came to him that looks just like an anatomical cross-section of a brain. And he sort of wrote up a report on it, and JAMA on October 10, 1990, made this article public.
If you don't mind if I interject really quick, what is JAMA?
JAMA is the Journal of American Medical Association, which is one of the biggest powerhouses of medical knowledge that we follow. And so they are not in a business of reporting something that is just sensational. So if they make it into the journal, then it has some credibility.
So a reputable source.
Correct.
You mentioned the cross-section of the brain. So basically, if you cut a brain in half and looked at it from the side, you'd be seeing it also overlaid on this picture.
Correct. So what you see is when you put an actual anatomical cross-section of a brain from a medical book right next to the background for God in that painting, you will see the markings and the anatomical partition very closely resemble each other. So initially we thought that that may be God is painted into a cross-section of a brain to think that God is the brain behind all creation. But as we went on, we figured out that there was more to it. This was about the Orion Nebula black hole, which is the closest black hole to Earth.
About how far away is it, do you know?
Orion Nebula is about 1,344 light years away from Earth. They roughly say 1,400 or a little more, a little less. You wouldn't think it's close enough to have any effect on our existence, but it is a black hole and it is the closest to us. So we are very interested about how it affects humanity, civilization, the development of intelligence, and development of humans.
So it seems like what the implications of your theory are that there must have been knowledge of things beyond what the human eye can see from Earth about space in ancient times, that either in the Vatican or some of these other ancient religions were aware of objects far beyond what the human eye can see from Earth.
Correct. As we were looking at the ancient information with Eva, we started looking at certain knowledge that we deducted from the stories, and our conclusion was that the only way the ancients could have written these stories is that they had space-age science knowledge, technology that allowed them to be outside of Earth's atmosphere. Certain things like the plane of the galaxy, where some of these black holes are located, are not seen with the naked eye and not even seen with telescopes.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in today's day and age, a lot of people aren't even aware that you can see the Milky Way galaxy from Earth because of all the light pollution. So to see even further into that definitely shows that there's a possibility of greater technology or something else that we're unaware of, right?
It's becoming more than just a possibility. It's almost becoming a proven fact, just putting together the knowledge that they're presenting to us, and then what we know with our own technology, going out to space, looking at the plane of the Milky Way galaxy and making observations on that. The ancients, as they were writing down these star constellations, in a very subtle way, showed that their knowledge went beyond even what we know now.
So you gave one example of a black hole, which is in the Orion Nebula, but my understanding is that there are 3 that you've discovered that you can correlate with ancient creation mythology. What's the next one?
The 3 most common that we looked at, first we looked at the Orion Nebula being the closest to us and probably the most important because of that. And then also we looked at the Cygnus star constellation, which is the goose or the swan, and that was also a very important one and commonly appearing in mythology. We've seen it in the Egyptians, and then we've seen it in Greeks. Almost every form, from the wild turkey.
Egyptians also, They're showing it in the Virgo, the Virgin, from August 20th until September 21st is the Virgo and the Virgin. And when you lay out the Milky Way goddess, you can see the Orion Nebula in her head, and you can see Cygnus constellations in her womb. So that's really interesting. And the third one, what is the biggest black hole, is in her umbilical cord, out of, actually, from our galaxy, what is called Cepheus.
So let's talk about the second black hole that you're talking about. That's in the constellation of Cygnus, correct?
Cygnus. So,
which is known as the Goose, or also the Cross, and commonly.
Northern Cross, or the Swan, or the Goose. Native Americans even wild turkey. But just to give you a little background of what we are asserting here, 6,000 years ago, there was an event, a cosmic event, which we translate as the eruption of the black hole from Cygnus. That's in the crossing of the cross, where that black hole Cygnus X-3 is located. So early Christians were saying that creation was on a day, March 25th, about 6,000 years ago. So we heard that from other great Christian believers, that they would say creation began 6,000 years ago. So we wanted to investigate that further, and both Eva and I looked at how is that possible. I mean, science are telling us that creation was more like 14 billion years ago, and now we have a number here, 6,000. And what we recognized that 6,000 years ago, around March 25th, there was a large eruption from this black hole, and that is what was termed as creation, but in reality it's just a recreation of an event, beginning of a new cycle in the climate.
Okay. It's very interesting. So potentially what we're saying is that maybe even some of these ancient religions that are talking about creation and science are actually not really conflicting, but maybe even somewhat in agreement here, because if it's a recreation, as you said, by potentially this black hole emitting such a large amount of energy, it might actually be affecting our solar system.
It is hard to imagine that a black hole, even on a plane of the galaxy, which makes it a much more powerful force, a stellar black hole 24,000 light years away, it is difficult to imagine that that would have effect on our Earth. But before I go into the Cygnus, just imagine this. There's a scientist, an astrophysicist, who claims that the December 26th, 2004 tsunami in Indonesia was due to gamma ray event 44.6 thousand light years away from us. That's on the other side of the galactic center. So,
well, is that similar? A lot of times when I've seen pictures of galaxies and they presume that there's a black hole in the center, what they'll show is that if you're looking at on a different light spectrum, like seeing, for instance, the gamma rays, you'd see large amounts of energy spewing out from both the points, basically the north and south axis. Is that kind of what you're talking about, that it could be directed maybe towards us, or?
Well, one of the aspects of these black holes is that there's some energy coming out of them. But on the other hand, as NASA is looking at them, there are smaller eruptions that are more powerful than the constant energy flowing from those rays that you're mentioning.
Maybe something like a solar flare? Would it be comparable
Similar.
to something like that?
Similar.
Like a cyclical event, potentially, or?
I don't think...
Repetitive cycle, or is it just kind of random so far right now, or?
I don't think we understand it yet. Yeah, I really don't know if we found the rhythm, other than in ice age cycles, we see that there are about 6,000 year up temperature, carbon dioxide, water, sea level elevation, methane. So a lot of those things that we are measuring for these climate cycles, we see about a 6,000 year cycle going up and then the temperature going down. And we have not been able to tell what causes it. And now we're going back to creation mythology, and maybe we're going to have an answer.
Very nice, very nice. So what about this third black hole that you mentioned? This one is in the constellation of Cepheus, correct?
The third black hole is what gave the title to our book, God's Generator. And that's the largest black hole that we found so far in the universe. It's 12.1 billion light years away from us. And that is close to where creation is mentioned by science 12 to 14 billion years ago. Universe was created by their timing. And so that black hole, which is called S50014 plus 81, is one of them that could be the first one and the largest one so far that we know. So that black hole is right at the tip of Cepheus, which is the king in the ancient Greek mythology. And also the nearest point is Polaris. That's our axis of rotation around the Earth where precession happens. So it's a very interesting position in the sky.
Is that the North Star?
Correct. Polaris, the North Star, which we know that that North Star gives us a little bit of spiral movement. In the last few decades, we've seen that the axis of the Earth does not just point to one area, and it's not exactly just Polaris, but if we measure it, it goes in a little bit larger and larger periphery.
Because of the wobble of the Earth's axis.
Because the wobble of the Earth axis, correct.
So Cepheus, you mentioned, was the king in ancient Greek mythology. You mentioned something about his crown. Can you talk a little more about that?
So one of the interesting things is that Cepheus itself looks like a crown or the hat. And if one wants to make a comparison, you would see that crown or the hat looking just exactly like what the Pope wears.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh. And so then a question comes, if all of these things that are present in mythology, and then what we see embedded in buildings, in temples, in symbols, in hats, in crowns of mythological kings, is it just they had a special taste for silly looking hats, or are they doing something to give us an answer about this scientific discovery that are coming our way?
So you mentioned a couple examples of the hats. The pharaohs also tend to wear large hats as well as the popes, and it does travel across a couple other cultures. But you mentioned something about the buildings. Can you give us some examples of what we might see comparatively among cultures and the buildings?
So one of the things that we noticed as we went to Vatican, and then we went to Venice and a number of other places in Europe, and we're looking at these beautiful cathedrals, and we're looking at the Vatican building and several other buildings in Italy and other countries. And as we were looking at them, what we found is that we had a cupola for the building as the roof, and a smaller contrapture or some...
like a sphere or something, right?
Some sphere, little knot.
Top, and a lot of times
correct.
Similar to like the chess piece, right?
Something like that. And as we were looking at it, because we knew it was about black holes in our mind, so we went ahead, looked up the binary black hole, how NASA sees it. And it showed us that it is actually a very similar shape to what the buildings are designed to. So that tells me that there's an ancient knowledge which may have been forgotten, but definitely it was carried on in the buildings themselves as a shape that became archaic and fashionable and almost a must. If you build a temple, if you build a cathedral, this is how you have to do it. A Congress, other buildings all seem to carry very similar.
Are you referring to like how in Congress or like courthouses will have the pillars, a lot of times like the triangle on top, right?
So my co-author, Dr. Jaramillo, was telling me about the Maya furnace. So when you look at Orion as a star constellation, the Mayans went ahead and defined where the black hole was by connecting the 2 feet of Orion to the last star in the belt of Orion. And that triangle, which is a pyramid shape, in the middle had the black hole positioned. And so that itself gave us an idea that a lot of these things relate to the Orion Nebula. So when we see a triangle, right away we connect it to the Orion Nebula, black hole. So we were thinking that when they put a triangle on any of these buildings and temples, that is an ancient reminder of the black hole that has been forgotten.
And you know those buildings are built with so much care and attention that the repetition of these same structures is not coincidental.
No, I agree. And then you have to ask yourself that how come that triangular shape has to be on that building? Why every building is built with 4 pillars holding up the triangle? That has to have a meaning. Is it the 4 cardinal points? Is it the 4 Hathors that we see in Egypt on the Dendera zodiac? What are we relating to? What are the ancient messages that we have not solved in our space-age scientific knowledge?
Well, so many of these buildings are so mathematically precise, and many times, for instance, the ones in Washington and a lot of other key points in the world are built by high-level masons or designed with mathematical precision that seems like it must have some deeper meaning than the general public is aware of.
Well, the Masons are amazing. Freemasons carry knowledge probably back from ancient Egypt and all over the world. So their knowledge base is such that I cannot even comprehend how much they know, how much they carried. And if they carried such a knowledge, did all of them know what they were carrying, or it was sort of just symbols and signs? But one of the things that Dr. Jaramillo and I sat down and talked about is that if everything is encoded in a pyramid, then we should have some relevance of the size of the pyramid as far as the circumference, the height. And then I seen one webpage talking about the inches of the height of the pyramid. And I started thinking, like, if we are the only country that maintained the inches as a way of measuring height distances, then there had to be a good reason for that. Scientifically, technologically, business-wise, it doesn't make sense to keep an ancient, archaic measurement like inches and not
just using the standard metric system that most other countries use, which is
of the world.
Much simpler to learn as a child. But
correct. We have 10 fingers, and it's easier to correlate that to the 10 centimeters or 100 centimeters in a meter. So one of the things that, as we were discussing this, again, we found out that the inches that, let's say, Britannica mentions, the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza, is 481.4 inches, somewhere around there. 481, between 481 and 482 feet, and that in inches comes out to be 5,776 inches. So somehow the correlation was made in reading up on these secrets and enigmas and measurements, where one of the places we found that the Hebrew year, when it equals the height of the pyramid, then we can expect climate changes to switch into a different pattern. So it was interesting to see the 5,776 inches as the height of the pyramid at Giza, because that we reached in 2016. And that was
equivalent to the Hebrew year.
It was equivalent to the Hebrew year.
700 was 2016.
And luckily nothing happened. You know, everything went fine. But it was just an interesting measurement, and as we were looking at it, we looked at the Declaration of Independence, 1,776, and that was an interesting contrast. 1,000, you add 4,000 to the 1,776, and you get 5,776. So these numbers sort of caught our interest, and we still don't understand what they mean in a whole scenario of things.
Interesting. So one of the other symbols that you mentioned was the all-seeing eye, which is prevalent in Masonic teachings. You see it on the dollar bill. And you mentioned that there's some correlation there with the constellation of Orion, if you just perceive it differently.
So the all-seeing eye is an enigma that a lot of people trying to solve. And if we assume that the Orion Nebula under the loincloth of Orion or in the sword of Orion is the point that we need to focus on, then we do an upside down aligning, meaning we connect the shoulder of Orion as the base of the pyramid and we point down toward that Orion Nebula. And that gives us the all-seeing eye, what we see on a $1 bill.
Which is related to the first black hole that we discussed.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more about the significance of Cygnus?
Sure. One of the things that brought the three black holes together was that we found these three black holes in the Milky Way that looked like a person. So first, we went and looked at the March time frame when they show the sky goddess Nut in Egypt, that we commonly know that it's the Milky Way, but we didn't know if there was a galactic virgin, and we started searching for that. And I let you have Eva talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's actually the Egyptian goddess is one of my favorite, and because that's the Milky Way, and the not the well, that's how we say it here. It's the goddess of the sky, and what when she bends down and it looks like a U shape. That's actually in a spring time in the skies, and she's kissing two suns. And one of the sun is actually in her mouth, what is the Orion Nebula. And that's absolutely amazing because they had beautiful stories about the Orion and the stories in the Egyptian mythology.
This is an Egyptian goddess, correct?
Yes, this is the Egyptian goddess, and the other one is in her womb, what is Cygnus, and what is represented in many other cultures is the virgin birth and the cross of the crosses. So the Egyptian depicted the goddess, the Milky Way, in beautiful forms.
And I believe your book also mentions something about the Galactic Virgin. The
Galactic Virgin actually It's in September. It's in August to September. And the ancient priesthood named the time of the season what is Virgo. And so
like in astrology.
That's like in astrology. And that time the Milky Way is flattened out, and that's where you can see the cross in her womb, and you can see the umbilical cord, actually the Cepheus, what is out of the galaxy, and her brain is the Orion.
Very interesting. Yeah, because the Virgin Goddess is mentioned throughout so many different cultures. Are there any other examples that you talked about in your book?
One of the most interesting one, and I'm so excited about that, is I think this is the first time that it's going to get out to the public, is the painting called Leda and the Swan. So Eva and I looked at several paintings. I mean, I would say we found at least 4 artists who painted it: Leonardo da Vinci, Francesco Melzi, Michelangelo, a number of others. And then there are mosaics throughout the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to France to Malta, you name it. There are these depictions. And when we went to the Vatican, we seen at least 2 sculptures that were about Leda and the Swan. So what do we see there is Leda, the queen, who's the mother of Helen of Troy, who started the Trojan War, is now having a relationship with the Cygnus Swan. She's married to the Trojan king, and then Zeus turns into the swan, flies in through the window, and seduces her. So that is the painting of ancient Greek creation mythology, where we see the queen and then we see the swan. And from their sexual relationship, we have 4 eggs. These 4 eggs become very significant in the mythology of creation. And these were 4 eruptions that happened from the Swan star constellation.
And yeah, swan would be an interesting choice, certainly, as a representation for that. So you have to wonder, if you see it repeated, how significant that really is. And you're saying many, many different cultures over a large amount of time were using this exact mythology.
Well, one of them that one needs to look at, who's into this sort of research, is look at the first avatar of Vishnu in the Hindu mythology. And what you see there, they show a big whale, or the big fish, who saved Manu as the first man in a time of the flood. Now, the boat that is next to the whale has a neck of a black swan, and it's tied to the blowhole of the whale, which is representing the point of Cygnus in the galactic plane. That is just amazing. So there are a lot of other stories, the Swan Lake, the ballet, and a number of other things that are prominent in our culture and points toward the secret knowledge of the swan being a very powerful force. And now for the first time, we are presenting this as a black hole. NASA says that Cygnus X3, which has, very interestingly, a 4.8-hour cyclicity, as that black hole turns and gives out a repetition of light and fading away, it happens very close to 4.8 hours. Why is that to me significant? Because 5 times 4.8 hours is a 24-hour period. And that tells me that maybe even our day has to do something with the rhythms that come out of Cygnus, the Northern Cross. And maybe a lot of the teachings that relate to Sacred Heart of Christ in our more recent Christian theology has to refer to that ancient sacred knowledge.
So are you maybe suggesting that some of the references to crosses in other cultures are also potentially related to this constellation?
Certainly, a study needs to be done and see if other parts of this story relates. But in my opinion, a lot of the stars that are shown in these star constellations that are displayed as a cross, as a goose, as a swan, gain prominence. So a goose or a wild turkey cannot have so much prominence in an ancient story unless there is a force behind it. So yes, I think that the cross in a number of representations hide the knowledge of the black hole. In a Hindu mythology, there is Brahma, Lord Brahma, and there's Brahman and Lord Brahma, so two separate entities. One seems to relate to the creator God, which we identify in God's generator. The other one seems to be related to Orion. But this Brahma rides on a goose, and it's called the Cosmic Goose. And that in itself tells us that they're talking about some cosmic forces that are connected. So not only that they show black holes, but they show a connection between, let's say, the largest black hole to Cygnus, the most powerful black hole in our galaxy, to the closest black hole in Orion Nebula. Now, that's just one example. Another example is when Vishnu and his consort or wife is sitting on a serpent bed, which to me is the Milky Way galaxy. So they're sitting on the serpent bed, the Milky Way. And as they're sitting there, Vishnu has an umbilical cord that comes out of his belly and shows up in the sky with a 4 or 5-headed Brahma, the main creator. So why is that important in our theory? Because when you look at the galactic Virgin in September, you see that Virgin has an umbilical cord. On top of that umbilical cord is Cepheus, which we identified as the largest black hole in our universe. So on a Hindu depiction, you see this umbilical cord ending up with Brahma, the creator god of the Hindu mythology, and that to me ties this to the largest black hole. So in a sense, even Hindu mythology is talking about the forces that come out of the universe, starting with the largest black hole. And that it makes sense. Who's the creator? Brahma. But who's Brahma? God's generator. The largest black hole that God uses for its power to keep the universe in a motion, to keep it in a balance, in a harmony, and in a creation. So now we have to start looking at these ancient stories with a much different eye.
Another question I have is, what would you say is the ultimate purpose of you doing all these years of research in this field?
One of the platforms that I'm thinking that would benefit society is to develop a formula for the monomyth and then recognize that basically it's astronomy and cosmology that is the basis of all of these stories, including almost all holy books and all stories from the Native Americans to the Bible to the Egyptians to the Greeks. Once we have a workable formula that states certain star constellations in certain places, then we have a framework. Within that framework, we can go in and look at different stories, identify the parts, and connect the story, because it's only one story. There's one God, there's one story of recreation, which happened to humanity. And it's all written down in a different version of varying ethnicities. But once you find the astronomy and cosmology, that is the unifying basis for all stories.